Hello, we will now begin the graduate seminar for Week 1, focusing on the oral cultures of the biblical world. Welcome to the first session of our seminar. The title of this slide is the contrast between text-based and oral cultures. Ours is a text-based culture, a culture of written documents. You need look no further than your computer screens to verify this assertion. There could only be an internet age if there was widespread literacy, which in turn leads to widespread production and reading of texts. Let us pause and really think about what this implies for us as modern interpreters of ancient sacred texts. We are completely surrounded by text. From the moment we wake up and check our smartphones, to the books we read, the emails we write, and the street signs we navigate by, our entire cognitive framework is structured by the written word. We process information silently, individually, and primarily through our eyes. This saturation of text has fundamentally rewired how we perceive authority, memory, and communication. We assume that if something is important, it must be written down, and its primary mode of consumption is silent reading. However, this is a massive historical anomaly. For the vast majority of human history, and specifically within the ancient Mediterranean context out of which the New Testament emerged, this was simply not the case. It is thus difficult for us in a text-based culture to conceive of and understand the character of an oral culture, much less understand how sacred texts function in such an oral culture. Imagine a world where information is passed down not through libraries or databases, but through the living breath of human beings. In an oral culture, memory is not outsourced to a hard drive or a piece of papyrus, it is a communal repository, sustained through storytelling, recitation, and rhetorical performance. When we approach the New Testament, we are often guilty of anachronism. We project our own textual habits onto ancient peoples. We imagine Paul sitting alone at a desk, writing a theological treatise for people who will also sit alone in their studies, silently reading and pondering his words. But this is a profound distortion. In an oral society, a text is not the end product, it is merely a script, a mnemonic device, a frozen moment of speech waiting to be thawed by the voice of a reader. Therefore, trying to comprehend how a sacred text functions in this environment requires a radical shift in our hermeneutical approach. We must learn to hear the text, not just see it. Yet, however difficult, it is important that we try to understand such a thing, since all of the cultures of the Bible were essentially oral cultures, not text-based cultures, and their texts were in fact oral texts, which some might think is an oxymoron, but in fact it is not so. Why might one consider an oral text to be an oxymoron? Because we naturally oppose the oral and the textual. But in antiquity, the written document was inextricably bound to the spoken word. The text was composed to be read aloud, to be performed. It was structured with oral cues, rhythms, repetitions, and sound plays that the ear would catch even if the eye did not. When we say the biblical cultures were oral cultures, we mean that the primary, most authoritative, and most pervasive mode of communication was oral. Even when something was written down, its ultimate destination was the ear of the community gathered together. This foundational understanding is the bedrock of rhetorical criticism. If we do not grasp the oral nature of this world, we will fundamentally misread the rhetoric of the New Testament. We will treat vibrant, persuasive, performative speeches as if they were dry, static essays. Throughout this seminar, I will continually push you to listen to the echoes of the spoken word within the written text. We must reconstruct the acoustic environment of the early church, where faith came from hearing, and where the Word of God was primarily an event, an auditory experience that commanded attention and demanded a response. Let us delve deeper into the implications of this shift. When an author in the first century composed a text, they were essentially engaging in a process of encoding speech. The act of writing was laborious and expensive, as we will discuss later, which meant that every word was carefully chosen not just for its semantic meaning, but for its acoustic impact. The ancient rhetorician was acutely aware of how syllables sounded when combined, how the cadence of a sentence could build anticipation, and how a sudden shift in tone could awaken a drowsy audience. This is the essence of an oral text. It is a document pregnant with sound. Furthermore, the communal nature of oral cultures cannot be overstated. Reading was not a solitary retreat, it was a social gathering. A text was performed in the midst of a congregation, making the reception of the message a shared experience. The reactions of the audience, their gasps, their murmurs of agreement, their collective silence, were part of the communication event. Therefore, as we study these texts, we must try to reconstruct not just the author's intent, but the dynamic interaction between the speaker, the text, and the gathered community. We must step out of our silent libraries and into the noisy, vibrant world of the ancient Mediterranean assembly. Only then can we truly begin to appreciate the masterful persuasion woven into the fabric of the New Testament. Moving to our next point, the title of this slide is Literacy Rates and the Preference for the Living Word. The literacy rate in those biblical cultures seems to have ranged from about 5% to 20% depending on the culture and which subgroup within the culture we are discussing. It is absolutely crucial that we internalize this statistic. In our contemporary, highly educated societies, we often operate under the subconscious assumption of universal literacy. We expect that anyone we encounter can read a sign, fill out a form, or comprehend a basic book. But the world of the New Testament was starkly different. A literacy rate of 5 to 20% means that the vast majority of the population, perhaps up to 95% in certain rural or impoverished areas, were entirely illiterate. They could not read a single word. Even the higher end of that estimate, 20%, was likely concentrated among the urban elite, scribes, government officials, and the wealthy classes who had the luxury of education. This demographic reality profoundly shaped how information was disseminated. If you wanted to start a movement, spread a message, or teach a new philosophy, writing a book and distributing it was simply not a viable strategy for reaching the masses. You had to speak. You had to preach, debate, and tell stories. The early Christian movement, which rapidly expanded across various social strata including the lower classes, was propelled not by mass-produced literature, but by the dynamic, persuasive power of the spoken word. This leads us directly to the cultural mindset of the time. Not surprisingly then, all ancient peoples, whether literate or not, preferred the living word, which is to say the spoken word. This preference for the living word is a fascinating aspect of ancient psychology. Even among the highly educated elite who could read and write fluently, there was a deep-seated suspicion of written texts and a strong preference for face-to-face, oral communication. Why? Because a text is static. It cannot answer questions, it cannot defend itself against misinterpretation, and it lacks the inflection, facial expressions, and body language of a live speaker. The ancient philosopher Plato famously critiqued writing because it could fall into the hands of those who do not understand it, and it weakens human memory. The living voice was considered more authentic, more reliable, and more authoritative because it was tied to a living person whose character and ethos could be evaluated in real time. Therefore, even when a text was utilized, it was seen as a secondary substitute, a mere shadow of the real thing, which was the actual spoken performance. This cultural prioritization of speech over text explains the immense value placed on rhetoric and oratory in the Greco-Roman education system. To be educated was not merely to know things, it was to be able to articulate them persuasively in public. No wonder Jesus said to his audiences, "Let those who have ears, listen." You notice he did not ever say, "Let those who have eyes, read." Most eyes could not read in the biblical period. This simple observation is incredibly profound. When we look at the pedagogy of Jesus as portrayed in the Gospels, it is entirely oral. He teaches in parables, aphorisms, and memorable sayings. He engages in sharp, witty debates with religious leaders. His method is perfectly calibrated for an oral culture. The repeated refrain concerning having ears to hear is not just a spiritual metaphor, it is a literal instruction reflecting the acoustic reality of his context. His followers had to rely on their ears, their auditory memory, and their communal reinforcement to retain his teachings. This acoustic orientation permeated the early church. When Paul wrote to the congregations he founded, he was not sending them an essay to be studied in silence, he was sending them a speech to be declaimed by a skilled reader. The authority of the apostles was primarily exercised through their voices, and when their physical presence was impossible, their letters served as vocal stand-ins. Understanding this helps us realize that the New Testament documents are not just theological repositories, they are transcripts of vibrant, oral events designed to capture the ear, move the heart, and persuade the mind of an audience that was listening intently. We must constantly remind ourselves that the early Christians did not go to church to read along in their personal scrolls. They went to listen. They went to hear the scriptures chanted, the letters performed, and the gospel proclaimed. The acoustic environment of the ancient house church was the crucible in which Christian theology was forged. When we analyze these texts, we are attempting to reverse engineer an auditory experience, looking for the rhetorical rhythms and mnemonic devices that made the message unforgettable to a predominantly illiterate audience. Let us turn to our next slide, titled Texts as Surrogates for Oral Communication. So far as we can tell, no documents in antiquity were intended for silent reading, and only a few were intended for private individuals to read. This is a concept that often astounds modern students. We are so accustomed to the solitary, silent act of reading. We curl up with a book in a quiet room, or we silently scroll through articles on our devices. But in the ancient Mediterranean world, reading was an inherently noisy and public activity. When someone read a scroll, they sounded out the words. The physical act of reading involved the vocal cords and the mouth just as much as the eyes. In fact, silent reading was considered such a bizarre anomaly that when St. Augustine encountered St. Ambrose reading silently in the 4th century, he recorded it in his Confessions as a marvel, an astonishing feat because documents were scarce and expensive, and because literacy was low, reading was almost always a communal event. A single literate individual would read the text aloud for the benefit of the many who could not read. This fundamentally changes how we must view the composition of these documents. An author was not writing for a solitary reader, they were writing for a gathered audience. They were scripting a performance. They were always meant to be read out loud and usually read out loud to a group of people. For the most part they were simply necessary surrogates for oral communication. Think about what a surrogate is. It is a substitute, a proxy, a stand-in for the real thing. In the context of the early church, the real thing was the physical presence and the living voice of the apostle or teacher. Paul deeply desired to be with his congregations, to speak to them face to face, to argue, to plead, and to encourage them directly. But geography, imprisonment, and missionary demands often made this impossible. Therefore, the letter was born out of necessity. It was a technology used to bridge the gap of absence. But we must not mistake the letter for a mere transfer of data. It was intended to evoke the actual presence of the author. When the lector, the designated reader, stood before the congregation in Corinth or Philippi and unrolled the papyrus, they were not just relaying information, they were reenacting Paul. They were meant to use the appropriate gestures, the correct tone of voice, and the necessary emphasis to bring Paul's words to life. The document was a compressed speech, waiting to be decompressed and delivered. This was particularly true of ancient letters. In fact, most ancient documents including letters were not really texts in the modern sense at all. When we hear the word letter, we often think of a brief, informal note, perhaps updating someone on personal news. Or, conversely, we might think of a formal, dry, business correspondence. But the documents of the New Testament, particularly the Pauline epistles, defy these modern categories. Because they were surrogates for oral communication, they were heavily infused with the techniques of classical rhetoric. They were speeches wrapped in an epistolary framework. They contained exordiums to win the audience's goodwill, narrators to state the facts, propositions to declare the main thesis, and perorations to stir the emotions at the conclusion. They utilized rhetorical questions, irony, diatribe, and sharp emotional appeals. All of these features are the hallmarks of oratory, not just casual letter writing. Therefore, to call them merely texts in the modern sense is to severely underestimate their dynamic, performative nature. They were composed with the ear in mind, designed to persuade a listening audience, to change their behavior, and to shape their theology through the power of a simulated oral encounter. As interpreters, we must read them not as static theological essays, but as vibrant, argumentative speeches that happen to have a greeting at the beginning and a benediction at the end. Moving forward, the title of this slide is The Oral and Oral Potential of Ancient Documents. They were composed with their oral and oral potential in mind, and they were meant to be orally delivered when they arrive at their destination. As we continue to unpack the oral nature of the biblical world, we must examine the actual construction of the sentences themselves. Ancient authors, particularly those trained in rhetoric, did not just string words together to convey naked facts. They were deeply concerned with the acoustics of their prose. They understood that the sound of the words, the rhythm of the clauses, and the musicality of the language were critical components of persuasion. This is what we mean by oral potential. The text was a musical score, and the words were the notes. When an author sat down to dictate to a scribe, they were listening to the cadence of their own voice, ensuring that the final product would sound majestic, authoritative, or pleading, depending on the rhetorical situation. This focus on delivery meant that a text was not considered complete until it was spoken aloud. The ink on the papyrus was just potential energy, the voice of the reader provided the kinetic energy that actualized the message. Thus, for example, when one reads the opening verses of Ephesians, loaded as it is with oral devices, assonance, alliteration, rhythm, rhyme, various rhetorical devices, it becomes perfectly clear that no one was ever meant to hear this in any language but Greek. The first chapter of Ephesians is one of the most magnificent examples of elevated Greek prose in the entire New Testament. In the original Greek, verses 3 through 14 actually constitute one massive, breathtakingly complex, and continuous sentence. It is a cascading waterfall of praise and theology. But what makes it truly remarkable is its sonic architecture. The author heavily employs assonance, which is the repetition of vowel sounds, and alliteration, the repetition of consonant sounds, to create a hypnotic, almost liturgical rhythm. There are subtle rhymes and carefully balanced clauses that create a sense of sweeping momentum. When this passage is read aloud by a skilled Greek orator, it is a tour de force of sonic beauty. It is designed to wash over the listeners, lifting their spirits and drawing them into a state of awe and worship. This acoustic brilliance is often completely lost in translation. When we read it in English, we might appreciate the theological concepts, but we miss the music. The fact that the author went to such extraordinary lengths to craft this acoustic masterpiece proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the auditory experience was paramount. The theology is embedded in the very sound of the words. And furthermore, no one was ever meant to read this silently. It needed to be heard. Let us dwell on this point. To read Ephesians silently is akin to reading the sheet music of a Beethoven symphony without ever actually hearing the instruments play. You can analyze the structure and understand the notes, but you completely miss the emotional impact and the visceral experience of the music. The ancient audience experienced the text physically, as sound waves hitting their eardrums. The rhythm would have dictated their breathing and captured their attention. The rhetorical devices were not just decorative fluff, they were functional tools designed to aid memory, emphasize key points, and stir the deep affections of the soul. Therefore, when we engage in rhetorical criticism, part of our task is to try to recover this lost dimension of sound. We must ask ourselves, how would this have sounded? Where are the pauses? Where does the volume increase? Where does the rhythm accelerate? By asking these acoustic questions, we move closer to the original experience of the early Christians. We begin to understand how a text, which looks so flat and silent on our printed pages, was originally a dynamic, living, and resounding force that shaped the faith and practice of the ancient church. Our next topic is titled The Cost and Mechanics of Ancient Writing. And indeed there was a further reason it needed to be orally delivered, because of the cost of making documents. A standard letter in Greek would have no separation of words, sentences, paragraphs or the like, little or no punctuation, and all capital letters. We have talked about the cultural preference for speech, but there were also harsh economic and mechanical realities that enforced the oral delivery of texts. In the ancient world, writing materials were extraordinarily expensive. Papyrus, manufactured from reeds in Egypt, was the primary writing surface, but it was costly to produce and transport. Ink had to be hand-mixed. Furthermore, the act of writing was a specialized skill, meaning that professional scribes, or amanuenses, charged premium rates for their services. Because every square inch of papyrus was valuable real estate, scribes could not afford to waste space with the formatting luxuries we take for granted today. There were no margins, no indentations for paragraphs, no spaces between words, and virtually no punctuation marks like commas or periods. The text was written in a format known as scriptio continua, or continuous script, using only uppercase letters. The letters were simply jammed together in an unbroken, solid block of ink from the top left corner of the page to the bottom right. This economic constraint drastically altered the cognitive process of reading. Thus, for example, imagine having to sort out a document that began as follows: PULSERVNTUFCHRSTJSUSCLLEDTOBENAPOSTLENDSEDPRTFORTHGOSPLOFGOD. Look at that string of letters in your mind's eye. If you were handed a document written entirely in this manner, your eyes would immediately struggle to parse the information. Without the visual cues of spaces and punctuation, your brain cannot easily identify word boundaries or grammatical structures. The visual processing centers of the brain are overwhelmed by the sheer density of the characters. In our modern formatting, spaces serve as visual resting points and cognitive dividers, allowing us to read silently at great speeds. But when you remove those dividers, silent reading becomes an excruciatingly slow and error-prone puzzle. You would have to meticulously scan each letter, trying to guess where one word ends and the next begins. Is a certain combination of letters meant to be combined or separated? The ambiguity is incredibly high. This brings us to the inevitable mechanical solution to this problem. The only way to decipher such a collection of letters was to sound them out loud. Because the eye could not easily separate the words, the ancient reader had to rely on the ear. By vocalizing the string of letters, the reader turned the visual puzzle back into acoustic speech. As they sounded out the syllables, the natural rhythms and familiar vocabulary of the spoken language would allow their auditory processing to recognize the word boundaries. They literally had to hear the text to understand it. This act of sounding out a text in scriptio continua was a slow, deliberate, and inherently vocal process. It required a skilled reader who could vocalize the text smoothly, adding the appropriate pauses and inflections that were completely absent from the written page. This is exactly why Paul and other ancient authors relied on trusted co-workers, like Timothy or Phoebe, to deliver their letters. The courier was not just a mail carrier, they were the designated performer. They had to already know the contents of the document, having likely rehearsed it with the author, so that they could navigate the continuous script without stumbling, placing the emphasis in the right places to effectively communicate the emotional and theological weight of the message. Therefore, the very physical construction of an ancient manuscript demanded that it be transformed back into a spoken event. Let us advance to the next slide, which is titled "The Function and Status of Texts in an Oral Culture." It is hard for us to wrap our minds around it, but texts were scarce in the biblical world, and often were treated with great respect. We live in an era of disposable texts. We print documents, skim them, and throw them in the recycling bin. We delete emails without a second thought. Books are mass-produced commodities. But in the ancient Mediterranean, a physical text was a rare and valuable artifact. Because of the exorbitant costs of papyrus, ink, and scribal labor we just discussed, the mere existence of a document signified importance. You did not commission a scribe and purchase papyrus to write down trivialities. Therefore, when a physical scroll or codex was brought into a community, it was handled with reverence. It was an object of awe, a tangible manifestation of effort, wealth, and significant communication. The physical text itself commanded respect before a single word was even read aloud. This scarcity fundamentally shaped the sociology of reading and writing. Since literacy was largely a skill only the educated had, and the educated tended to be almost exclusively from the social elite, texts in such a world served the purpose of the elite, conveying their authority, passing down their judgments, establishing their property claims. Let us analyze the power dynamics at play here. In a society where perhaps 90% of the people cannot read or write, the ability to do so is not just a practical skill, it is a profound instrument of power. The social elite, the aristocrats, the wealthy landowners, the civic magistrates, and the high-ranking religious officials, monopolized literacy. Consequently, the written word was primarily utilized to maintain and project their dominance. Texts were the mechanisms of imperial bureaucracy, recording tax rolls, military orders, and legal decrees. They were the instruments of economic control, detailing property deeds, debt records, and slave ownership. When a peasant encountered a written document, it usually meant that a higher authority was demanding taxes, enforcing a law, or asserting control over their life. The text was a symbol of the elite's coercive power. However, it is a massive mistake to view ancient texts purely through the lens of secular politics or economics. But since all ancient people were profoundly religious, the most important documents even among the elite were religious texts. The ancient world did not possess our modern, post-Enlightenment division between the secular and the sacred. Religion permeated every aspect of civic, economic, and domestic life. The gods were believed to be actively involved in the affairs of humanity, and securing their favor was a matter of state security and personal survival. Therefore, the most prestigious, the most carefully preserved, and the most deeply venerated documents were those that contained the words, decrees, or mythologies of the divine. This is incredibly important for understanding the context of the New Testament. When early Christians began to produce and circulate their own sacred texts, they were tapping into this profound cultural reservoir of awe and authority. A letter from an apostle, recognized as a spokesperson for the risen Christ, was not just pastoral advice, it was a document crackling with divine authority. It was treated with the kind of reverence typically reserved for the highest imperial decrees or ancient oracles. The physical texts of the Gospels and the epistles became treasured possessions of the early house churches. They were carefully guarded, meticulously copied, and publicly performed as the very Word of God. By utilizing the elite technology of the written text, the early Christian movement subverted the typical power dynamics, using the tools of the powerful to disseminate a message of a crucified and resurrected Savior to a community that spanned across the social spectrum, from wealthy patrons to illiterate slaves. Moving to our next point, the title of this slide is Literacy and Rhetorical Skill Among Early Christian Leaders. What do texts in an oral culture tell us about their authors? It is too seldom taken into account that the 27 books of the NT reflect a remarkable level of literacy, and indeed of rhetorical skill amongst the inner circle of leaders. When we encounter a text from antiquity, it acts as an archaeological artifact that reveals the educational background and social standing of its creator. There is a persistent, romanticized myth in popular imagination that the early church was exclusively a grassroots movement of poor, illiterate fishermen and peasants, completely disconnected from the intellectual currents of the Greco-Roman world. While it is true that the majority of early believers were likely from the lower and artisan classes, the documents they left behind tell a very different story about their leadership. The 27 books of the New Testament are not crude, unpolished jottings. They display a wide range of sophisticated literary and rhetorical techniques. They utilize complex argumentation, advanced vocabulary, and an intimate familiarity with the persuasive strategies taught in the rhetorical schools of the empire. This level of linguistic mastery was not acquired casually, it required years of expensive, rigorous education. Early Christianity was not, by and large, a movement led by illiterate peasants or the socially deprived. We must drastically adjust our historical lens. The individuals guiding the theological formation and geographical expansion of the early church, figures like Paul, Luke, the author of Hebrews, and others, were highly educated individuals. They belonged to, or at least had access to, the educational elite of their society. Take the Apostle Paul, for instance. He describes himself as a Pharisee, deeply trained in the Jewish scriptures, but his letters also reveal an astonishing command of Hellenistic rhetoric, Greek philosophical concepts, and the conventions of civic debate. Luke, the author of the Gospel that bears his name and the Acts of the Apostles, writes with the polished, sophisticated Greek of a trained historian, utilizing the formal prologues and speech summaries characteristic of the finest Greco-Roman historiography. The author of Hebrews crafts a magnificent, rhetorically flawless sermon that rivals classical oratory in its structural elegance. These were not the works of unlettered men. They were the products of brilliant, highly trained minds who leveraged their extensive education for the service of the gospel. The leaders of the movement mostly produced the texts of the movement, and the texts of the NT reflect a considerable knowledge of Greek, of rhetoric, and indeed of general Greco-Roman culture. This observation is paramount for our study of rhetorical criticism. Because the authors possessed this considerable knowledge, we must assume they used it intentionally. They did not accidentally write persuasive documents, they engineered them using the established rules of ancient rhetoric. They knew how to structure an exordium to capture the audience's goodwill. They knew how to deploy a narratio to lay out the facts of a situation. They understood how to construct a probatio, utilizing logical, ethical, and emotional proofs to build an airtight argument. And they knew how to deliver a crushing peroration to move the will of the listeners to action. Therefore, if we are to accurately interpret these texts, we cannot ignore the rhetorical scaffolding upon which they are built. We cannot simply extract theological propositions while ignoring the persuasive packaging. We must analyze the New Testament documents using the very same rhetorical categories and handbooks that their authors would have known and utilized. Recognizing the high educational status of the early Christian leaders forces us to engage their writings with a deeper level of analytical rigor, respecting the profound intellectual and rhetorical sophistication embedded in every chapter and verse. Our next slide is titled NT Letters as Rhetorical Discourses and Homilies. The letters we find in the NT are mostly far longer than secular letters of their era. Actually, they are not in the main letters, though they have epistolary openings and closings sometimes. This is a critical paradigm shift in how we categorize the New Testament literature. When archaeologists excavate ancient sites in Egypt and uncover mundane, everyday papyrus letters, such as a soldier writing to his mother, or a businessman ordering supplies, these secular letters are incredibly brief. They usually consist of a standard greeting, a sentence or two stating the business at hand, a brief health wish, and a sign-off. They are perhaps a few dozen words long. In stark contrast, Paul's letter to the Romans is over 7,000 words long. 1 Corinthians is similarly massive. Even Philemon, one of his shortest writings, is significantly longer and vastly more complex than the average personal letter of antiquity. This extreme disparity in length is our first massive clue that we are dealing with a completely different genre of literature. The epistolary openings and the final greetings are merely the envelope. But the contents of the envelope are not typical letter material. They are in fact discourses, homilies, and rhetorical speeches of various sorts that the creators could not be present to deliver to a particular audience, and so instead they sent a surrogate to proclaim them. This is the heart of the matter. If we read Romans or Galatians simply as personal correspondence, we will misinterpret their structure and their intent. They are, fundamentally, speeches. The author of Hebrews explicitly calls his own massive document a word of exhortation, which was the standard synagogue term for a sermon. 1 John has no epistolary opening or closing whatsoever, it is a pure, unadulterated homily, a powerful piece of epideictic rhetoric praising Christian values. Even in Paul's writings, once you move past the initial greeting and the opening thanksgiving, which often brilliantly serves as the rhetorical exordium to preview the upcoming arguments, you are plunged into the world of formal rhetorical discourse. Paul is acting as a forensic orator defending his apostleship, or a deliberative orator urging a congregation toward unity and concord. Because Paul could not physically stand in the assembly at Corinth to debate the factions, or stand in Galatia to refute the rival teachers, he wrote down his speeches. He scripted his arguments, his emotional appeals, and his theological proofs, and then he dispatched them. But a script requires an actor. These documents would not be handed to just anyone. From what we can tell, Paul expected one of his co-workers such as Timothy, Titus, or Phoebe to go and orally deliver the contents of the document in a rhetorically effective manner. Think about the logistics of this process. Paul finishes dictating the majestic, complex arguments of the book of Romans to his scribe, Tertius. He does not then hand this priceless, singular copy to a random merchant traveling to Italy. He entrusts it to Phoebe, a deacon and a patron of the church. But Phoebe is not merely the postwoman. She is the designated orator. She has likely sat with Paul, listened to him dictate it, and understands the exact tone, the pauses, the sarcasm, and the pleading embedded in the text. When she arrives in Rome, she stands before the gathered house churches and she performs the document. Because the text is written in continuous script, without punctuation, it requires a skilled and rehearsed reader to deliver it smoothly. Phoebe must know exactly where to raise her voice in indignation, where to soften it in pastoral care, and how to effectively deliver the crushing rhetorical questions that Paul has penned. The delivery was a performative, auditory event designed to simulate the apostles' physical presence and persuasive power. Therefore, as modern interpreters, we must read these letters with our ears, anticipating the inflections and rhetorical strategies of a live speech. Moving to our next slide, the title is The Performative Power of the Sacred Word. How then did a sacred text function in an oral culture? For one thing, it was believed that words, especially religious words, were not mere ciphers or symbols. They were believed to have power and effect on people if they were properly communicated and pronounced. In our modern, scientific worldview, we tend to view language as entirely utilitarian and descriptive. Words are just labels we attach to things. They are abstract symbols that convey data from one brain to another. But the ancient Mediterranean worldview, and particularly the ancient Semitic worldview, perceived language in a radically different way. Words possessed an almost tangible, physical reality. They were not just descriptive, they were performative. To speak a word was to release a force into the world. This is why blessings and curses were taken with such deadly seriousness in antiquity. A curse was not just an insult, it was a spiritual weapon unleashed against an enemy. A blessing was a concrete transfer of vitality and favor. In this paradigm, religious words, incantations, prayers, and the divine names, were charged with intrinsic, explosive power. If the proper syllables were vocalized with the correct intonation, they could heal the sick, cast out demons, or alter the course of nature. The spoken word was an event of power. Consider for example what Isa 55:11 says, "So shall my word be that goes forth out of my mouth, it shall not return to me void, but it shall accomplish that which I please, and it shall prosper in the thing I sent it to do." This famous passage from the prophet Isaiah perfectly encapsulates the biblical theology of the spoken word. Notice the active, almost independent agency attributed to God's utterance. God speaks, and the word goes forth like an emissary, like a commissioned general. It does not merely convey information about God's intentions, it actively executes those intentions. The word itself accomplishes the task. It brings about reality. We see this right at the beginning of the biblical narrative in Genesis chapter 1. God does not build the universe with his hands, he speaks it into existence. He speaks, and the acoustic vibration of the divine voice brings forth light and matter. This understanding of language is fundamental to understanding early Christian preaching and the reading of the New Testament documents. When the gospel was proclaimed, it was not just a lecture on a new philosophy, it was the unleashing of the dynamic, salvific power of God into the assembly. The word or words of a living and powerful God were viewed as living and powerful in themselves. Because God is alive and active, his utterances share in that divine vitality. This is why the author of Hebrews can declare that the Word of God is living and active, sharper than any two-edged sword. It is a surgical instrument that pierces the soul. When we realize that the early Christians viewed the scriptures and the apostolic speeches through this lens of performative power, it completely changes our understanding of their gatherings. The public reading of a Pauline letter was not an academic exercise. It was a highly charged spiritual event. The congregation listened with the expectation that the very words being spoken over them would actively transform them, heal them, judge them, and save them. The text was venerated because it was the acoustic container for the living power of the Creator. To engage with rhetorical criticism, therefore, is not merely to dissect literary techniques, it is to study the precise mechanisms by which the early church believed the power of God was transmitted and made effective in the hearts and minds of the believers through the medium of persuasive, spoken language. We have reached our final slide for this session, titled Rhetoric versus Epistolary Conventions as the Dominant Paradigm. Analyzing the majority of the NT on the basis of epistolary conventions, many of which did not become de rigueur nor put into a handbook until after NT times, while a helpful exercise to some degree, has no business being the dominant literary paradigm by which we examine the Pauline, Petrine, Johannine, and other discourses in the NT. For many decades in modern biblical scholarship, there was a heavy emphasis on form criticism and epistolary analysis. Scholars meticulously compared the New Testament letters to the thousands of secular papyrus letters found in Egypt, identifying the standard formulas for greetings, thanksgivings, and closings. While this research was undeniably helpful for understanding the basic envelope of these documents, it hit a massive roadblock when trying to explain the vast, complex bodies of the texts. Why? Because the art of the personal letter essay, the kind of literary letter popularized by figures like Cicero just prior to the New Testament era, was a relatively new phenomenon. The strict rules and handbooks dictating how to write complex theological or philosophical treatises in letter form simply did not exist or were in their absolute infancy during the time of Paul and Peter. Trying to force the massive, argumentative structures of Romans or 1 Corinthians into the narrow, undeveloped categories of first-century letter writing is like trying to fit a symphony orchestra into a phone booth. The epistolary categories break down because they were never designed to hold that much weight. The dominant paradigm when it came to words and the conveying of ideas, meaning, and persuasion in the NT era was rhetoric, not epistolary conventions. If we want to understand how a first-century author constructed a lengthy, persuasive argument, we must look to the discipline that actually taught them how to do it. That discipline was rhetoric. Unlike letter writing, which was just beginning to be systematized, rhetoric had a massive, distinguished pedigree stretching back hundreds of years to Aristotle, Plato, and the golden age of Greek democracy. By the 1st century, rhetoric was the undisputed king of the educational curriculum. From elementary exercises to advanced tertiary training, every educated person was steeped in the art of persuasion. There were established, universally recognized rules for how to invent arguments, how to arrange them logically, and how to style them for maximum emotional impact. Whether an author was composing a defense speech for a law court, a deliberative speech to guide a community's future, or an epideictic speech to praise a virtue, the rhetorical handbooks of Aristotle, Quintilian, and Cicero provided the structural blueprints. Because the New Testament authors were engaged in the ultimate task of persuasion, convincing the Greco-Roman world that a crucified Jewish carpenter was the Lord of the universe, they naturally reached for the most powerful communicative tools available to them. This is why I will say now that most of the NT owes far more to rhetoric and its very long-standing and widespread conventions than it ever owed to the nascent practice of writing letter essays, or letter treatises. This conclusion is the cornerstone of our entire approach in this seminar. When we read a document like Galatians, we are not reading a casual letter that accidentally wandered into theological debate. We are reading a fiercely constructed deliberative discourse, meticulously arranged according to ancient rhetorical law to persuade a straying congregation to return to the true gospel. When we read the speeches in the book of Acts, we are seeing a masterful historian employing rhetorical summaries to propel the narrative and demonstrate the power of the Christian message. The micro-rhetorical devices, the intense questions, the shocking hyperboles, the biting ironies, and the macro-rhetorical structures, the carefully crafted exordiums and perorations, are the very skeletal framework of the New Testament. If we ignore the rhetoric, we ignore the architecture of the text. By adopting rhetorical criticism as our dominant paradigm, we align ourselves with the acoustic, performative, and highly persuasive reality of the ancient biblical world. We learn to hear the texts as they were meant to be heard, and we unlock the profound strategies the early Christians used to change the world with the living word. The fundamental disparity between oral and text-based cultures. Ours is a text-based culture, a culture of written documents. It is thus difficult for us in a text-based culture to conceive of and understand the character of an oral culture, much less understand how sacred texts function in such an oral culture. Welcome to the core analytical portion of our seminar, where we must confront our deepest interpretive biases. As modern scholars and students, we operate within a matrix defined by the printed page and the digital screen. We unconsciously treat the written word as the primary reality, a silent object to be dissected in the quiet solitude of a library. However, to faithfully engage the world of the New Testament, we must radically deconstruct this assumption. The biblical world was fiercely acoustic. It was an environment where memory, vocal performance, and auditory reception were the essential pillars of intellectual and spiritual life. In this ancient context, a text was not an isolated artifact, it was an echo of a living voice, waiting to be reactivated through speech. When we fail to recognize this fundamental disparity, we risk silencing the very rhetorical power that these documents were engineered to unleash upon their original audiences. Our challenge today is to transcend our text-bound limitations and learn to listen to the scriptures as they were meant to be heard. Yet, however difficult, it is important that we try to understand such a thing, since all of the cultures of the Bible were essentially oral cultures, not text-based cultures, and their texts were in fact oral texts, which some might think is an oxymoron, but in fact it is not so. The concept of an oral text requires us to completely reorient our hermeneutical approach. It is not an oxymoron but a historical reality that defines ancient composition. An oral text is a document meticulously crafted for auditory delivery. The authors, steeped in the rhetorical traditions of their time, wove acoustic markers into their syntax, utilizing rhythm, alliteration, and strategic repetition to guide the speaker and captivate the listeners. These texts were scripts designed for communal performance, meant to resonate in the physical spaces of early house churches. Recognizing this transforms our exegetically task. We are no longer merely parsing grammar, but rather we are reconstructing an ancient acoustic event. We must pay close attention to the oral mechanics embedded within the Greek syntax, appreciating how the cadence of the words served to persuade, comfort, or challenge the gathered assembly. This auditory lens is absolutely critical for our advanced rhetorical criticism, as it grounds our analysis in the authentic historical and cultural conditions of early Christianity. Literacy rates, textual scarcity, and the primacy of the spoken word. The literacy rate in those biblical cultures seems to have ranged from about 5% to 20% depending on the culture and which subgroup within the culture we are discussing. Not surprisingly then, all ancient peoples, whether literate or not, preferred the living word, which is to say the spoken word. When we consider the demographic realities of the first-century Mediterranean world, we are immediately confronted with the stark limitations of ancient education. The ability to read and write fluently was a highly specialized skill, largely confined to the social and administrative elites. The vast majority of the population navigated their daily lives, their commerce, and their religious devotion entirely through spoken communication. This prevailing illiteracy did not denote a lack of intelligence or culture, rather, it fostered a profound reliance on memory and auditory processing. In such a society, the living word possessed a vitality and immediacy that ink on papyrus could never match. A speaker could adapt to the audience, infuse emotion through vocal inflection, and command attention through physical presence. The spoken word was trusted, whereas texts were often viewed merely as secondary records. Therefore, the dissemination of the Christian gospel was inherently an oral phenomenon. It spread not primarily through the distribution of tracts, but through the dynamic, face-to-face proclamation of evangelists and teachers who commanded the rhetorical skills necessary to engage an audience unaccustomed to private reading. Texts were enormously expensive to produce, papyrus was expensive, ink was expensive, and scribes were ultra-expensive. Being a secretary in Jesus's and Paul's age could be a lucrative job indeed. No wonder Jesus said to his audiences, "Let those who have ears, listen." The sheer material cost of creating a manuscript in antiquity is a factor we frequently underestimate. Papyrus had to be harvested, processed, and transported. High-quality ink was a precious commodity. Furthermore, the labor of a trained scribe was exorbitant, making the production of a document a major financial investment. Consequently, texts were rare and highly valued assets, not disposable commodities. This economic reality heavily influenced pedagogical methods. Jesus of Nazareth, operating as a master teacher within this environment, perfectly tailored his instruction to the constraints and strengths of an oral society. He did not distribute reading assignments, he crafted memorable parables, rhythmic aphorisms, and striking rhetorical figures that could be easily retained and transmitted by ear. His recurring exhortation to let those who have ears listen was not merely a spiritual metaphor, but a highly practical acknowledgement of his pedagogical context. The ear, not the eye, was the primary organ of reception for divine revelation. This fundamentally shapes our understanding of the gospel traditions, as they were initially forged in the crucible of oral performance long before they were ever committed to expensive papyrus. Ancient documents as oral compositions and oral surrogates. So far as we can tell, no documents in antiquity were intended for silent reading, and only a few were intended for private individuals to read. They were always meant to be read out loud and usually read out loud to a group of people. For the most part they were simply necessary surrogates for oral communication. The concept of silent reading, as we practice it today, was virtually unknown in the Greco-Roman world. Reading was inherently a vocal and communal activity. When a text was opened, it was intended to be given voice. This public recitation transformed the act of reading into an acoustic performance, drawing a gathered community into a shared experience of the text. Documents were generally dispatched only when physical presence was impossible. They acted as oral surrogates, standing in for the absent author. The letter carrier was not simply a courier, but an orator tasked with delivering the author's message with the appropriate rhetorical force and emotional inflection. This means that every epistle in the New Testament was originally experienced as a dramatic, spoken event within the context of a house church liturgy. The text was the architectural blueprint, but the spoken voice was the building itself, erecting a structure of persuasion and exhortation around the listeners. In fact, most ancient documents including letters were not really texts in the modern sense at all. They were composed with their oral potential in mind, and they were meant to be orally delivered when they arrive at their destination. Thus, for example, when one reads the opening verses of Ephesians, loaded as it is with oral devices, it becomes perfectly clear that no one was ever meant to hear this in any language but Greek. The authors of the New Testament deliberately engineered their compositions to exploit the acoustic properties of the Greek language. They were fully aware that their words would be performed, and thus they packed their prose with rhetorical ornamentation designed specifically for the ear. We see extensive use of assonance, where vowel sounds echo one another, and alliteration, which provides a rhythmic, percussive quality to the phrasing. The opening of the letter to the Ephesians is a masterful example of this acoustic architecture. It is a cascading symphony of sounds that builds theological momentum through its auditory brilliance. When we translate these documents into modern languages and read them silently, we inevitably lose a significant portion of their original persuasive power. The acoustic resonance was not mere decoration, it was an integral component of the theological argument, designed to captivate the audience, aid in memorization, and elevate the discourse to a level of transcendent beauty that demanded a response of faith and obedience. The physicality of texts, scriptio continua, and interpretation. Because of the cost of making documents, a standard letter in Greek would have no separation of words, sentences, paragraphs, or the like, little or no punctuation, and all capital letters. The material constraints of antiquity dictated the very formatting of the written word. To maximize the use of incredibly expensive papyrus, scribes employed a technique known as scriptio continua, a continuous, unbroken stream of capital letters devoid of spaces, punctuation marks, or paragraph breaks. Imagine confronting a solid wall of text with no visual cues to guide your phrasing or comprehension. This dense, unyielding format meant that a document could not simply be skimmed for information. It required an active, laborious process of decipherment. The reader had to meticulously sound out the syllables, dividing the continuous stream of letters into intelligible words and sentences through the act of vocalization. This physical interaction with the manuscript reinforced the inherently oral nature of reading. The text remained entirely opaque until it was breathed into existence. It required a skilled, literate performer who had likely familiarized themselves with the contents beforehand, ensuring they could place the correct emphases and pauses to accurately convey the author's rhetorical intent to the waiting audience. The only way to decipher such a collection of letters was to sound them out loud. There is of course the famous anecdote about Saint Augustine and Saint Ambrose. Augustine said that Ambrose was the most remarkable man he had ever met, because he could read without moving his lips or making a sound. This historical anecdote profoundly illustrates the sheer rarity of silent reading in the ancient world. Even by the late 4th century, the ability to read without vocalizing was considered an extraordinary, almost miraculous feat for the vast majority of literate individuals throughout antiquity. The vocal cords and the lips were inextricably linked to the cognitive process of reading. This acoustic necessity meant that the act of reading was never a purely internal, silent dialogue between the reader and the page. It was always a physical, auditory manifestation. Therefore, when the early Christians gathered to hear the apostolic letters, the reading was a vibrant, sonic event. The text was wrestled from the papyrus through the effort of the human voice. This reality underscores our fundamental premise: the New Testament documents were acoustic phenomena. Their theological weight and rhetorical power were designed to be unleashed in the atmosphere of communal listening, making the study of their oral dynamics absolutely essential for any rigorous academic exegesis. Literacy, social stratification, and early Christian leadership. It is too seldom taken into account that the 27 books of the New Testament reflect a remarkable level of literacy, and indeed of rhetorical skill amongst the inner circle of leaders of the early Christian movement. Early Christianity was not, by and large, a movement led by illiterate peasants or the socially deprived. For a long time, a pervasive myth has colored our historical reconstruction of the early church, characterizing it almost exclusively as a grassroots movement of the uneducated and the impoverished. While it is certainly true that the gospel appealed powerfully to the marginalized, this sociological generalization completely fails to account for the intellectual pedigree of its primary architects. A rigorous analysis of the New Testament corpus reveals a stunning degree of linguistic sophistication, structural complexity, and rhetorical mastery. The men who composed these texts were not unlettered rustics, they were highly capable intellectuals operating at the upper echelons of ancient literacy. To construct the elaborate arguments of Romans or the elegant prose of Luke Acts required years of intensive, elite education within the Greco-Roman pedagogical system. Acknowledging this reality fundamentally shifts our understanding of the apostolic circle. We are dealing with strategic, highly trained communicators who possessed the advanced cultural capital necessary to navigate and challenge the intellectual currents of the Roman Empire. The leaders of the movement mostly produced the texts of the movement, and the texts of the New Testament reflect a considerable knowledge of Greek, of rhetoric, and indeed of general Greco-Roman culture. This skill and erudition can only seldom be attributed to scribes, except in cases where scribes had been converted and donated their skills. While the use of an amanuensis, or secretary, was a common practice in antiquity, we cannot simply attribute the rhetorical brilliance of the New Testament to hired scribes. The theological depth, the sustained argumentative logic, and the masterful deployment of Greco-Roman culture and rhetoric point undeniably to the authors themselves. Figures like the Apostle Paul or the evangelist Luke possessed a formidable command of the Greek language and an intimate familiarity with classical rhetorical forms, such as the diatribe, the encomium, and advanced deliberative argumentation. They were perfectly fluent in the cultural scripts of their day, allowing them to subvert, transform, and appropriate these conventions for the defense and proclamation of the Christian message. This level of erudition indicates that the early Christian leadership actively engaged the intellectual elite of the ancient world on their own terms, utilizing the very finest tools of classical persuasion to advance the revolutionary claims of the gospel. New Testament documents as orally delivered rhetorical discourses. The letters we find in the New Testament are mostly far longer than secular letters of their era. Actually, they are not in the main letters, though they have epistolary openings and closings sometimes. They are in fact discourses, homilies, and rhetorical speeches of various sorts. When we compare the epistles of the New Testament to the standard, everyday correspondence recovered from ancient rubbish heaps, the contrast is immediately apparent. Mundane secular letters were typically brief, pragmatic, and highly formulaic, dealing with simple matters of commerce or basic family updates. In stark contrast, the Pauline epistles are expansive, complex, and profoundly theological. While they frequently utilize standard epistolary framing devices, such as the opening prescript and closing greetings, the vast expanse of the material between these bookends defies simple categorization as a mere letter. Instead, we must recognize these documents for what they truly are, highly developed rhetorical discourses. They function as written homilies, judicial defenses, and deliberative exhortations. Because the apostles could not be physically present in every burgeoning congregation, they crafted these masterful speeches to serve as their authoritative voice in absentia. Recognizing this structural reality is paramount. It compels us to analyze these texts not by the rules of casual letter writing, but by the rigorous, established canons of classical rhetorical theory, looking for the exordium, the narratio, and the probatio that construct the persuasive argument. Paul expected one of his co-workers such as Timothy, Titus, or Phoebe to go and orally deliver the contents of the document in a rhetorically effective manner. This would have been almost a necessity since the document would come without division of words or punctuation. The transmission of these complex discourses was not left to chance. Paul did not merely hand his manuscripts to a random traveler and hope for the best. He entrusted these precious, expensive documents to his closest, most capable associates, individuals who had been intimately trained in his theology and his rhetorical cadence. These letter carriers were, in essence, the first expositors and performers of the New Testament. Given the arduous nature of reading Scriptio Continua, the carrier would have rehearsed the text, understanding exactly where to place emotional emphasis, where to pause for dramatic effect, and how to execute the rhetorical questions that pepper Paul's arguments. They were tasked with delivering the discourse with the full persuasive power of the apostle himself. This dynamic process highlights the intensely personal and performative nature of early Christian communication. The written text was the indispensable anchor, but the oral delivery by a trusted emissary was the mechanism that brought the apostolic authority to life within the gathered assembly. The performative power and reverence of sacred words. How then did a sacred text function in an oral culture? For one thing, it was believed that words, especially religious words, were not mere ciphers or symbols. They were believed to have power and effect on people if they were properly communicated and pronounced. In our modern, secularized understanding of language, we tend to view words merely as arbitrary signs pointing to external realities, tools for transferring data from one mind to another. However, the ancient mindset operated on a vastly different metaphysical plane. In the biblical world, words were ontological realities. They possessed an inherent, dynamic force. This was especially true concerning religious or divine language. Spoken words were not viewed as empty breath, but as active agents capable of shaping reality, imparting blessing, or executing judgment. When properly communicated and pronounced, sacred words were believed to exert a palpable, transformative effect upon the listeners. This performative understanding of language is critical for grasping how early Christians interacted with their scriptures. The public reading of a sacred text was not merely an educational exercise to impart theological facts, it was a potent spiritual event. The recitation of the words was believed to unleash the very power of the divine into the midst of the congregation, actively confronting the listeners, demanding a response, and altering the spiritual atmosphere of the assembly. The word or words of a living and powerful God were viewed as living and powerful in themselves. One can then imagine how a precious and expensive document, which contained God's own words, would be viewed. It would be something that needed to be kept in a sacred place. This profound reverence for the performative power of the spoken word naturally extended to the physical manuscripts that preserved those words. A scroll containing the prophetic utterances or the apostolic witness was not treated as a common household object. Because it was the physical repository of the living and active voice of God, the document itself was treated with immense veneration. Combined with the staggering economic cost of producing such a manuscript, these texts were fiercely guarded treasures. They were the focal point of the community's spiritual identity, meticulously copied, carefully preserved, and stored in spaces designated as sacred. The privilege of unrolling and proclaiming these texts was reserved for authorized individuals whose moral and spiritual character aligned with the holiness of the words they were tasked to speak. Understanding this extreme reverence helps us appreciate the gravity and the awe that accompanied the public reading of the Scriptures in the early Church, an experience of encountering the divine presence mediated through ink, papyrus, and the human voice. Rhetorical saturation versus nascent epistolary conventions. The dominant paradigm when it came to words and the conveying of ideas, meaning, and persuasion in the New Testament era was rhetoric, not epistolary conventions. This is why I will say now that most of the New Testament owes far more to rhetoric and its very long-standing and widespread conventions than it ever owed to the nascent practice of writing letter essays. As we transition to the methodology of our textual analysis, we must firmly establish the correct interpretive framework. For decades, biblical scholarship placed immense weight on analyzing the New Testament epistles through the lens of ancient letter-writing conventions. While acknowledging the epistolary framework is useful for understanding the opening and closing formulas, it falls drastically short when we attempt to decipher the vast theological arguments contained within the body of the documents. In the first-century Greco-Roman world, the environment was completely saturated with rhetorical training and performance. Rhetoric, the formalized art of persuasion, was the cornerstone of all higher education and public life. In contrast, the practice of using a personal letter as a vehicle for a complex philosophical or theological treatise was a relatively new, nascent phenomenon, only recently popularized by figures like Cicero. Therefore, to unlock the structural logic and persuasive mechanics of the New Testament, we must prioritize the ancient, deeply ingrained paradigm of classical rhetoric over the emerging, and far less systematic, conventions of the letter essay. Analyzing the majority of the New Testament on the basis of epistolary conventions, many of which did not become standardized nor put into a handbook until after New Testament times, while a helpful exercise to some degree, has no business being the dominant literary paradigm by which we examine the Pauline, Petrine, Johannine, and other discourses. The danger of relying too heavily on epistolary analysis is that it often forces us into historical anachronism. Many of the formalized rules for letter writing that scholars have tried to apply to the New Testament were not actually codified into instructional handbooks until well after the apostolic era. To impose these later, rigid epistolary categories onto Paul or John is to misread their intentions and their methods. Instead, we must recognize that these authors, operating in a highly competitive intellectual marketplace, naturally reached for the most powerful and universally recognized tools of communication available to them, the tools of classical rhetoric. The epistles are, at their core, rhetorical discourses cloaked in a thin epistolary veil. When we shift our dominant literary paradigm from the letter to the speech, the internal architecture of these documents suddenly snaps into sharp focus. We begin to see the deliberate progression of arguments, the strategic emotional appeals, and the masterful use of traditional proofs, allowing us to engage the text exactly as the original authors engineered it to be understood. Defining rhetorical criticism, the historical enterprise. Rhetorical criticism is by definition the study of rhetoric, whether ancient or modern, with a broad definition of rhetoric being the art of persuasion. As applied to the field of New Testament studies, rhetorical criticism has been approached in two rather different ways by scholars. To properly engage the biblical text, we must clearly define our methodology. Rhetorical criticism, in its most fundamental sense, is the rigorous analysis of how communication is designed to persuade an audience. It investigates the strategies, structures, and stylistic choices an author employs to influence belief and behavior. However, within the specific discipline of New Testament studies, this field has bifurcated into two distinct methodological camps. The modern approach, heavily influenced by contemporary literary theory and linguistics, often attempts to apply modern rhetorical models and categories back onto the ancient text. While this can yield interesting literary observations, it fundamentally divorces the text from its original historical context. It asks questions that the original authors could never have conceived, utilizing terminology they would never have recognized. To avoid this anachronistic trap, we must clearly delineate our approach and commit to a methodology that respects the historical boundaries and the intellectual horizons of the first-century world. The first way is more of an historical enterprise, seeking to analyze the New Testament documents on the basis of ancient Greco-Roman rhetoric, asking and answering the question of how the New Testament authors may or may not have used this art. I would insist that the primary and first task is to ask the appropriate historical questions about the New Testament text and what its ancient authors had in mind. The approach we champion in this seminar is strictly historical. This methodology, pioneered by scholars like George Kennedy and Hans-Dieter Betz, insists that we evaluate the New Testament documents using exclusively the rhetorical handbooks, categories, and conventions that existed during the Greco-Roman period. We must interrogate the text using the tools of Aristotle, Cicero, and Quintilian. Our objective is to uncover the authorial intent by asking how these ancient writers adopted, adapted, or subverted the established rules of the classical art of persuasion to advance the Christian gospel. This historical enterprise demands that we immerse ourselves in the educational curriculum of antiquity, understanding how a first-century audience would have instinctively processed a forensic defense, a deliberative exhortation, or an epideictic display. By restricting our analysis to the categories the authors themselves knew and utilized, we bridge the temporal gap, gaining an authentic, historically grounded window into the sophisticated argumentative strategies that propelled the early Christian movement. Micro-rhetoric, macro-rhetoric, and the structural anatomy of persuasion. By micro-rhetoric I mean the use of rhetorical devices within the New Testament documents, for instance the use of rhetorical questions, dramatic hyperbole, personification, amplification, irony, enthymemes, and the like. More controversial is whether macro-rhetoric is also used in the New Testament. As we execute our historical analysis, we must distinguish between two distinct levels of rhetorical engagement. The first level is what we term micro-rhetoric. This involves the localized, tactical use of specific stylistic devices to enhance the vividness and emotional impact of a sentence or a paragraph. The New Testament is absolutely saturated with these techniques. We see Paul deploying rapid-fire rhetorical questions to trap an opponent, Jesus using dramatic hyperbole to emphasize the cost of discipleship, and the use of profound irony in the Passion narratives. The presence of these micro-rhetorical flourishes is universally acknowledged by scholars. However, the more complex and fiercely debated question is the extent to which the New Testament authors employed macro-rhetoric. Did they merely sprinkle their writings with clever stylistic devices, or did they deliberately construct the entire overarching architecture of their documents according to the formalized rules of classical rhetorical composition? Our analysis affirms that in the major epistles and discourses, macro-rhetoric is undeniably the organizing principle. By macro-rhetoric I mean whether the overall structure of some New Testament documents reflects the use of rhetorical categories and divisions used in ancient speeches. Those divisions are as follows: exordium, narratio, propositio, probatio, refutatio, and peroratio. All 6 of these normal divisions of an ancient speech could be found in the 3 different species of ancient rhetoric: forensic, deliberative, and epideictic. To master macro-rhetoric, we must understand the fundamental anatomy of an ancient speech. A formally constructed discourse was organized into 6 primary divisions. It began with the exordium, designed to establish rapport and secure the goodwill of the audience. This was followed by the narratio, a statement of the background facts. The crucial pivot was the propositio, the core thesis statement. The bulk of the speech was the probatio, where the logical proofs and arguments were deployed, often followed by a refutatio, anticipating and destroying counter-arguments. Finally, the discourse concluded with the peroratio, a powerful emotional appeal designed to move the audience to action. Furthermore, this structural architecture was adapted to fit one of three major species of rhetoric. Forensic rhetoric was the language of the law court, focused on attacking or defending past actions. Deliberative rhetoric was the language of the political assembly, focused on persuading an audience toward a future course of action. Epideictic rhetoric was the language of the public square, focused on praising or blaming a subject in the present. By mapping these specific macro-rhetorical blueprints onto the New Testament documents, we unlock the profound logical flow, the strategic intent, and the ultimate persuasive goal of the biblical authors. Welcome to our advanced seminar session. Today, we are focusing on the concluding applications of our study on the oral cultures of the biblical world. The title of this first slide is The Inadequacy of the Epistolary Paradigm. As we seek to draw conclusions and apply our historical understanding to exegesis, we are immediately confronted with a major paradigm shift. Consider this critical assertion from our text. Analyzing the majority of the New Testament on the basis of epistolary conventions, many of which did not become de rigueur nor put into a handbook until after New Testament times, while a helpful exercise to some degree, has no business being the dominant literary paradigm by which we examine the Pauline, Petrine, Johannine, and other discourses in the New Testament. This is a foundational realization for us as graduate scholars. For far too long, the academic community has attempted to force the dynamic, living documents of the New Testament into the rigid, and often anachronistic, categories of Hellenistic epistolography. While it is certainly true that these documents possess basic epistolary features, such as prescripts and postscripts, relying on these conventions as the primary interpretive lens is deeply flawed. The handbooks on letter writing that scholars often cite were largely systematized well after the New Testament documents were written. Therefore, applying these later standards to texts written in the mid-1st century leads to a fundamental misunderstanding of the author's structural and persuasive intentions. The application for our own exegetically work is clear: we must abandon the epistolary paradigm as our primary framework. This requires a complete methodological overhaul. We can no longer afford to read these ancient texts through the lens of modern literary correspondence or even later ancient letterwriting manuals. Let us move to the second foundational quote on this slide. The dominant paradigm when it came to words and the conveying of ideas, meaning, and persuasion in the New Testament era was rhetoric, not epistolary conventions. Here, the author provides the necessary corrective. If the epistolary framework is inadequate, what must replace it? The answer is the rhetorical paradigm. In the deeply oral and oral culture of the first-century Mediterranean world, the primary vehicle for persuasion, education, and public discourse was rhetoric. This ancient art of persuasion permeated every level of society, from the marketplace to the law courts, and certainly into the assemblies of the early Christian movement. When Paul or Peter crafted their messages, they were not sitting down to write quiet, private essays. They were composing powerful, persuasive speeches meant to be delivered orally and heard orally by a gathered community. Therefore, our application must be to equip ourselves with the tools of ancient rhetorical criticism. We must learn to identify the exordium, the narratio, the propositio, and the peroratio. We must train our ears to hear the strategic use of pathos, logos, and ethos. By doing so, we align our interpretive methods with the actual historical and cultural realities of the biblical authors, ensuring that our exegesis is both historically grounded and hermeneutically sound. This paradigm shift is not merely academic, it fundamentally changes how we preach, teach, and understand the living word today. It forces us to confront the text as a spoken event, an oral performance designed to persuade and transform its original audience. Let us proceed to our second slide, titled Rhetoric over Epistolary Practice. Building upon our previous discussion, we must deeply apply this paradigm shift to our understanding of the New Testament corpus. Our text makes a definitive claim. This is why I will say now that most of the New Testament owes far more to rhetoric and its very long-standing and widespread conventions than it ever owed to the nascent practice of writing letter essays, or letter treatises. To fully grasp the magnitude of this statement, we must remember the historical timeline. The art of rhetoric had been developed, refined, and taught for centuries by the time of the New Testament, tracing its roots back to Aristotle and beyond. It was a mature, pervasive system of communication. In stark contrast, the practice of writing philosophical or theological letter essays was a relatively recent development, just beginning to gain traction through figures like Cicero. It is a historical misstep to assume that early Christian leaders, operating in a highly oral culture, would bypass the established, powerful tools of ancient rhetoric in favor of a nascent literary trend. Our application, therefore, is to prioritize rhetorical analysis over epistolary analysis when examining these texts. The structures and strategies of persuasion found in Aristotle and Quintilian are far more relevant to our exegesis than the emerging letter-writing manuals. Let us examine the second vital quotation on this slide. Most of the letters of the New Testament, with the exception of the very shortest ones, like 2nd and 3rd John, perhaps Philemon, look very little like the very mundane pragmatic epistolary literature of that era. In terms of both structure and content, most New Testament documents look far more like rhetorical speeches. Here, the practical application for our research becomes undeniable. If we compare the letters of Paul to the everyday, pragmatic papyri discovered in Egypt, the mundane business receipts, the brief personal notes, the differences are staggering. The New Testament documents are vast, complex, and deeply argumentative. They are not simply conveying information, they are designed to change beliefs and behaviors. They are, in essence, rhetorical speeches captured in ink. When we encounter the book of Romans or the book of Hebrews, we are not reading a private letter, we are reading a sermon, a homily, a deliberative or forensic discourse. This realization demands that we approach the text not as silent readers, but as an engaged audience listening to a masterful orator. We must analyze the flow of the argument, the emotional appeals, and the structural divisions just as we would if we were evaluating a speech given in the Greco-Roman Forum. This fundamentally alters our interpretive posture and enriches our theological conclusions. Moving forward, our third slide is titled Pervasiveness of Microrhetoric. Thus far, we have largely considered the broad, overarching structures of the text, but the application of rhetorical criticism must also permeate the granular level of our exegesis. Consider this excerpt from our textbook. Not only so, but microrhetoric clearly enough shapes at least three things: the chrai, or aphorisms, in the Gospels, the speech summaries in Acts, and the way portions of a book like Revelation are linked together by catchword and ABA structure. This passage is incredibly revealing because it demonstrates that the influence of the oral and rhetorical culture was not limited to the grand speeches of the Apostle Paul. It penetrated every genre of New Testament literature. The Gospel writers, for instance, utilized the chrai, which are short, memorable anecdotes culminating in a striking saying or action. This was a fundamental exercise in ancient rhetorical training known as the progymnasmata. When we read the Gospels, we are encountering highly polished rhetorical units designed for oral performance and persuasion, not merely raw historical data. Similarly, the speech summaries in the book of Acts are not verbatim transcripts but carefully crafted rhetorical compositions by Luke, designed to suit the speaker, the audience, and the occasion. Even the apocalyptic visions of Revelation are structured using rhetorical linking devices to aid the listener's memory and comprehension in an oral setting. Let us turn to the second quote for further application. In other words, rhetoric is not just something that illuminates Paul and other portions of the so-called epistolary corpus in the New Testament. It is a necessary tool for analyzing almost all of it. The crucial takeaway for our seminar is the absolute necessity of microrhetoric in our analytical toolkit. Whether you are specializing in the synoptic Gospels, the historical narratives of Acts, or the apocalyptic literature of Revelation, you cannot escape the need for rhetorical criticism. As you prepare your dissertations and academic papers, you must look for these micro-rhetorical devices: the use of rhetorical questions, hyperbole, personification, irony, and incomplete syllogisms known as enthymemes. These were the tools of the trade for first-century writers seeking to persuade their audiences. If we ignore these devices, we risk flattening the text, missing the subtle nuances and the persuasive force that the original authors intentionally embedded within their words. Our exegetically application requires a meticulous, verse-by-verse sensitivity to the rhetorical artistry that characterizes the entire New Testament corpus, allowing us to reconstruct the vibrant, oral performance that these texts originally constituted. Welcome to our next segment. The title of this slide is Defining Rhetorical Criticism in New Testament Studies. Having established the necessity of a rhetorical paradigm, we must now define exactly what we mean by rhetorical criticism and how it is practically applied in our field. Let us look at the first critical definition provided in our text. Rhetorical criticism is by definition the study of rhetoric, whether ancient or modern, with a broad definition of rhetoric being the art of persuasion, though sometimes it has degenerated into the art of speaking well, or mere verbal eloquence. As graduate scholars, you must grasp this fundamental distinction. Rhetoric, in its purest and most ancient form, was not merely about aesthetic ornamentation or sounding impressive to a crowd. It was fundamentally about the art of persuasion, which is the deliberate, strategic structuring of language to effect a change in the beliefs, attitudes, or behaviors of an audience. When rhetoric degenerates into mere verbal eloquence, or what was sometimes known as sophistic rhetoric, it loses its philosophical grounding and its persuasive force, becoming a superficial display of skill. Our application is to recognize that the New Testament authors were not engaging in empty eloquence, they were employing serious, persuasive strategies to establish early Christian communities and defend theological truths against intense opposition. We must therefore approach rhetorical criticism not as a study of literary flourish, but as a rigorous study of persuasive intent and pastoral strategy. Now, let us consider the specific historical application of this discipline as described in our second quotation. The first way, pioneered and championed by George Kennedy and Hans Dieter Betz and their students, is more of an historical enterprise, seeking to analyze the New Testament documents on the basis of ancient Greco-Roman rhetoric, asking and answering the question of how the New Testament authors may or may not have used this art. This quotation outlines the historical approach to rhetorical criticism, which is paramount for our exegesis. Rather than imposing modern theories of communication onto the biblical text, this approach seeks to understand the text within its own historical and cultural milieu. Scholars like Kennedy and Betz urge us to look at the handbooks of Aristotle, Cicero, and Quintilian, the very educational frameworks that permeated the Greco-Roman world of the first century. By asking how Paul or Luke adapted these ancient techniques for their Christian purposes, we engage in a truly historical enterprise. The application for your own research is to immerse yourselves in the primary sources of ancient rhetorical theory. Only by understanding the rules of persuasion that governed the ancient Mediterranean world can we accurately decipher how the biblical authors utilized, subverted, or transcended those rules to proclaim the gospel. This historical anchoring is what prevents our interpretations from becoming anachronistic and ensures that our scholarship remains rigorous, objective, and faithful to the original historical context. As we continue our methodological evaluation, we arrive at our fifth slide, titled The New Rhetoric versus the Historical Approach. In the landscape of academic biblical studies, you will encounter multiple methodologies claiming the title of rhetorical criticism. It is crucial that we distinguish between them and understand their respective applications. Let us review the first excerpt. The second approach, growing out of modern language theory and modern epistemology, when it comes to the issue of texts and meaning, has been pioneered and championed by Vernon Robbins and his students, and seeks to apply certain modern rhetorical categories to the text, for example, categories such as inner texture or intratexture. This describes what is often called socio-rhetorical criticism. While this approach has gained popularity, we must critically evaluate its application. This methodology is heavily indebted to modern linguistics, structuralism, and contemporary epistemology. It introduces categories like inner texture, intertexture, and ideological texture to dissect the biblical text. While analyzing the social and ideological layers of a text can yield fascinating sociological insights, the application of entirely modern categories to ancient documents raises significant historical concerns. We are essentially asking questions of the text using a vocabulary and a conceptual framework that the original authors could never have comprehended. As exegetes committed to historical accuracy, we must be exceedingly cautious about anachronism. Imposing modern language theory onto first-century documents can obscure the original communicative intent. Let us look at the second quotation to solidify this critique. Both the terminology and the method, as well as the theory of meaning of this latter approach, has more in common with the new rhetoric of Henrik Losberg and others than with the rhetorical guidelines established by Aristotle, Quintilian, Menander, and other practitioners of ancient rhetoric. The author draws a sharp line in the sand here. The new rhetoric is fundamentally disconnected from the classical rhetorical guidelines that actually shaped the educational and cultural environment of the biblical writers. When Paul composed his letters, he was not utilizing modern concepts of intratexture, he was utilizing the principles of invention, arrangement, and style as taught by ancient practitioners like Quintilian and Menander. Therefore, our primary application must be to prioritize the ancient handbooks over modern sociolinguistic theories. If our goal is to uncover the author's original intent and the audience's original reception, we must use the tools that belong to their world. While modern theories can serve as secondary, heuristic lenses, they must never supplant the rigorous, historical investigation of Greco-Roman rhetorical structures. We must train ourselves to read the text through the eyes of an ancient rhetorician, rather than a modern linguist, to truly capture the persuasive power of the biblical message. We now reach a decisive moment in our seminar with our sixth slide, Methodological Primacy of Ancient Rhetoric. Having outlined the competing schools of thought, we must now draw a firm methodological conclusion for our own academic practice. The text frames the debate perfectly in our first quote. The methodological issue here is whether the New Testament should only be analyzed on the basis of categories the New Testament authors themselves could have known and used, or not. In my view, both approaches can yield good insights into the biblical text, but the attempt to fuse the methods of Old and New rhetoric confuses more people than it enlightens. This is a profound warning for anyone engaging in biblical exegesis. There is a temptation in modern scholarship to create a hybrid methodology, attempting to blend ancient historical analysis with modern literary theory. However, the author rightly points out that fusing the old and the new often results in methodological confusion rather than clarity. The categories of ancient rhetoric are based on the conscious, strategic choices of the orator, whereas modern rhetorical theories often deal with subconscious sociological or ideological forces. Trying to apply both simultaneously leads to a disjointed interpretation. Therefore, our application is to maintain methodological purity and clarity. We must decide what questions we are asking of the text. If our primary goal is historical exegesis, we must restrict ourselves to the categories available to the authors. Let us examine the author's final verdict in the second quote. I would insist that the primary and first task is to ask the appropriate historical questions about the New Testament text and what its ancient authors had in mind. When that is the prime mandate, then only analysis on the basis of Greco-Roman or ancient Jewish rhetoric is appropriate, since ancient authors were completely innocent and ignorant of modern rhetorical theory and epistemology. This is the cornerstone of our exegetically application. Our prime mandate as biblical scholars is to uncover the original historical meaning and the authorial intent. Because the ancient authors were completely ignorant of modern epistemology and structuralism, using those modern tools as our primary lens is fundamentally flawed. We must rigorously apply Greco-Roman and ancient Jewish rhetorical principles because these were the only tools the authors possessed. By reconstructing the educational and rhetorical environment of the first century, we can accurately trace the logic, the emotional appeals, and the structural design of the biblical documents. This historical discipline ensures that our interpretations are not reflections of modern biases, but authentic recoveries of the ancient, persuasive Word of God as it was originally delivered to the early Church. Turning to our seventh slide, we explore the concept of macro-rhetoric in the New Testament documents. Having firmly established our historical methodology, we must now apply it to the overarching architecture of the biblical texts. Let us read our first selection from the textbook. More controversial is whether macro-rhetoric is also used in the New Testament. By macro-rhetoric I mean whether the overall structure of some New Testament documents reflects the use of rhetorical categories and divisions used in ancient speeches. Those divisions are as follows: exordium, narratio, propositio, probatio, refutatio, and peroratio. Understanding these 6 divisions is absolutely essential for your exegetically work. While scholars generally accept the presence of small rhetorical devices, identifying the macro-rhetoric, the grand structural design, has been more debated. However, classical speeches were not haphazardly thrown together, they followed a deliberate sequence designed to maximize persuasion. The exordium builds rapport, the narratio states the facts, the propositio presents the thesis, the probatio offers the proofs, the refutatio dismantles opposing views, and the peroratio drives home the emotional conclusion. The application for us is profound. When we outline a biblical book, we should be looking for these specific structural markers rather than arbitrary thematic divisions. This brings us to the crucial application found in our second quote. In particular, Paul's letters, 1 Peter, and the homilies called Hebrews and 1 John reflect these larger macrostructures of rhetoric, often in great detail. The macrostructures, however, are used with some flexibility and they are enfolded within epistolary frameworks in some cases. This demonstrates that macro-rhetoric is not a fringe theory, but a demonstrable reality across major sections of the New Testament. When we study the book of Romans or the epistle to the Hebrews, we are tracing the masterful deployment of these ancient rhetorical divisions. However, the author provides a critical caveat: these structures are used with flexibility and are often enfolded within an epistolary framework. The biblical authors were not slaves to a rigid handbook, they were skilled practitioners who adapted the rules to fit their specific pastoral and theological needs. They combined the opening and closing greetings of a letter with the robust, argumentative body of a classical speech. Our task as exegetes is to untangle these blended forms. We must learn to recognize where the epistolary greeting ends and the rhetorical exordium begins, and how the entire document drives toward a persuasive peroratio. This dynamic structural analysis will dramatically enrich our understanding of the text's theological argument. Let us advance to our 8th slide, titled Epistolary Frameworks and Rhetorical Exordiums. As we delve deeper into the structural analysis of the New Testament, we must confront the severe limitations of purely epistolary outlines. Consider the author's critique in our first quotation. These epistolary categories, however, help us very little in analyzing the structure of the material if one is not dealing with the epistolary opening and closing elements, such as the prescript, travel plans, opening or closing greetings. This statement directly challenges the traditional way many commentaries outline the epistles. While recognizing the sender, the recipient, and the final greetings is straightforward, these epistolary categories completely fail us when we attempt to analyze the vast theological and ethical arguments that comprise the bulk of the text. An epistolary framework simply lacks the analytical vocabulary to explain why Paul moves from a theological exposition to a moral exhortation, or how he constructs a complex defense against his opponents. Therefore, our application is to stop relying on inadequate letter-writing categories to explain profound theological discourse. We must transition our analytical vocabulary from epistolary terms to rhetorical terms to unlock the true structure of the text. The necessity of this transition is made abundantly clear in our second quotation. Furthermore, there was no ancient convention to have a thanksgiving prayer at the outset of an ancient letter, nor are we helped by lumping the vast majority of a discourse under the heading of body middle, which tells us nothing really about the document and was not an ancient epistolary category anyway. This is a brilliant deconstruction of common exegetically fallacies. How often have we read outlines that divide a Pauline letter into introduction, thanksgiving, body middle, and conclusion? The author rightly points out that body middle is a meaningless, modern invention that tells us absolutely nothing about the actual flow of the argument. Furthermore, the famous Pauline thanksgiving prayers are not standard epistolary conventions. In the secular papyri, you might find a brief health wish, but not a sprawling theological prayer. Instead, we must recognize these thanksgiving sections for what they truly are. They function as the rhetorical exordium. They are designed to establish rapport with the audience, build the speaker's ethos, and intricately preview the major themes and propositions that will be argued later in the discourse. By applying this rhetorical understanding, we suddenly see that Paul is not just being politely pious, he is strategically setting the stage for his entire persuasive argument. This completely revolutionizes how we analyze the opening chapters of any Pauline epistle. We are nearing the conclusion of our seminar with our 9th slide, the ad hoc and surrogate nature of New Testament documents. This slide provides a profound application regarding the very essence and function of the biblical texts in the life of the early church. Let us examine the first striking statement from our text. Even Paul's letters were not meant to be privately studied. In the first instance, they were surrogates for the speeches Paul would have made could he have been present with his audience. This is a vital corrective to our modern, individualized reading habits. Today, we sit in silent libraries, poring over printed texts in isolation. But the original context was entirely communal and auditory. When Paul's emissary arrived in Corinth or Philippi, the congregation gathered together, and the letter was performed, read aloud with the appropriate inflection, emotion, and emphasis. The written document was merely a stand-in, a physical surrogate for the apostles' living, speaking presence. Our application as interpreters is to mentally reconstruct this oral performance. We must ask ourselves, how would this sentence have sounded? Where would the orator have paused for dramatic effect? How would the audience have audibly reacted to this shocking rebuke or this comforting promise? By reading the text as a script for a surrogate speech, we recover its original vibrancy. Let us look at the second quote, which details the implications of this reality. As such, they partake of all the ad hoc characteristics of such purpose-driven ancient speeches. They were intended as timely remarks, on target to affect belief and behavior of the various audiences. They were not intended merely as theological or ethical treatises. Rhetorical criticism helps us realize the dynamic and interactive nature of these documents. This is the ultimate application of rhetorical criticism, recognizing the intensely ad hoc, situational nature of the New Testament. These documents were not written in a vacuum as abstract, systematic theologies meant for a timeless archive. They were urgent, purpose-driven interventions into specific, messy community crises. Paul wrote to solve immediate problems, to correct dangerous errors, and to vehemently persuade his listeners to alter their behavior and beliefs in real time. When we treat these letters merely as repositories of abstract doctrine, we strip them of their pastoral urgency and their dynamic, interactive power. Rhetorical criticism forces us to keep the historical exigency at the forefront of our exegesis. We must continually ask, what specific crisis precipitated this argument, and what exact behavioral change was the author attempting to persuade the audience to adopt? We have arrived at our 10th and final slide, conclusion, the primacy of oral paradigms. Here, we synthesize everything we have discussed into a final, comprehensive application for our ongoing scholarship. Let us read the first concluding thought from the textbook. The teaching of rhetoric had a long and distinguished pedigree. Indeed, there were whole schools in antiquity devoted to the subject in places like Alexandria, Ephesus, Athens, and Rome. Letter writing, however, was an art only beginning to be systematized, especially when it came to something like the letter essays of a Cicero or his later disciples. This historical reality must serve as the bedrock for all our future exegesis. We are dealing with authors who lived in a world saturated with rhetorical education. The great cities of the Mediterranean were defined by their schools of rhetoric, where the art of persuasion was considered the pinnacle of higher education. The early Christian leaders, many of whom were highly educated and fiercely dedicated to spreading their message, naturally utilized this dominant, sophisticated system of communication. To assume they relied primarily on the underdeveloped, newly systematized practice of letter writing is to fundamentally misjudge the intellectual climate of the first century. Our application must be a relentless commitment to understanding that educational and cultural pedigree. Let us finish with the author's ultimate summary statement. The oral and rhetorical culture dominated, and texts had to fit into its paradigms, not the other way around. So let us consider ancient education at this juncture. This is the definitive conclusion of our seminar. The written text in the ancient world was a servant to the spoken word. The oral and rhetorical culture was the undisputed master paradigm, and any document produced in that era had to conform to its rules, its rhythms, and its persuasive strategies. We cannot force ancient oral texts to fit into our modern, text-based paradigms. Doing so is an act of exegetically violence. Instead, we must humble ourselves, immerse ourselves in the study of ancient education, and allow the text to fit into its own original, rhetorical paradigms. As you leave this seminar and return to your research, your translation work, and your preaching, I urge you to let the living, spoken nature of the biblical world transform your approach. Read the New Testament not just with your eyes, but with your ears, always listening for the powerful, persuasive voice of the ancient orator echoing through the centuries. Thank you for your rigorous attention today.